A warm welcome to everyone to the anesthesia classes. The topic that we're going to deal today is neuromuscular monitoring. See, neuromuscular monitoring, the importance of neuromuscular monitoring lies in the fact that skeletal muscle relaxation is an integral part of the general anesthesia component. That is, the pentad of general anesthesia is compromised of skeletal muscle relaxation. And to the surprise, the residual effect of the neuromuscular relaxants that we give is up to an incidence of 22 to 40%, which means that if we are not monitoring the neuromuscular relaxants, the block that has been given, and we don't know whether we have reversed the patient completely or not, there is chances that 40% of patients in the post-operative period will have residual paralysis even then, and this paralysis is too hazardous for the patient. Of course, it can lead to various laryngeal and pharyngeal dysfunctions. It can lead to your airway obstruction, and the patient can have hypoxia, hypocarbia, or the risks of aspiration increases, eventually leading to pneumonia, which can increase the mortality as well as morbidity of the patient, especially the extremes of age or the patients who have certain comorbidities associated with them. Not only the residual paralysis matter, but also matters is the compromise of the surgical field if we are underusing our relaxants. So we have to balance both the parts of the seesaw, that is under as well as overuse of the neuromuscular monitoring should not be there. So let's get started. The first thing before we start with neuromuscular monitoring, I just want to recapitulate the NMJ junction. See, what is the neuromuscular junction? Neuromuscular junction is nothing but a complex which compromises of the first, the motor end plate, that is the motor nerve. The end of the motor nerve, when we see, has been, see, it's like a mushroom shaped, and this is known as the terminal button. That is the terminal button of the motor nerve with the synaptic cleft plus your muscle fiber end plate, that is the motor end plate. This is the motor end plate which has been changed into junctional folds. So this is the three things which interact with each other, that are the terminal buttons of your axon, the motor nerve, your synaptic cleft, and eventually the junctional folds at the motor end plate. Now whenever the action impulse comes, the action impulse that is coming is also known by the name of threshold or maximal stimulus. That is the stimuli which is given in the form of, this is something you all have to remember, in the form of a current denoted by milliampere. Okay, and it must be like 20 to 60 milliamperes, which is the adequate current for the excitation of the muscle fibers. So whenever this threshold of stimuli, which is needed so that the action impulse can be propagated through the motor nerve, and eventually it leads to the introduction of calcium in the terminal button, which leads to the joining of these vesicles. These vesicles which are present in the terminal button are also known as the synaptic vesicles, which have acetylcholine in them. Around 5,000 to 10,000 molecules of acetylcholine are present in one vesicle, and there are thousands of such vesicles which are present. They're also known by the name of photons. And these terminal buttons have special proteins. The name of them you all have to remember. We have SNAP proteins, which are special proteins which are present on these terminal buttons which thicken them also, or syntaxin protein. To be quite specific, there are two types of syntaxin proteins which are present on these vesicles which help them in joining these terminals. See, these synaptic vesicles is eventually joined it and they are ready for exocytosis. So the proteins who are responsible for joining these vesicles to this are synaptobrevin and synaptogramin, and eventually they get exocytosis into the synaptic cleft. Here the acetylcholine is present eventually, which joins with the receptors which are nicotinic acetylcholine receptors present at the junctional folds, and when this acetylcholine joins these receptors, there is influx of sodium and outflux of potassium, leading to the muscle contraction. In the muscle contraction, we follow the all or none phenomena. Please remember this. In the muscle contraction, we always follow the all or the none phenomena. That is, either none of the muscle fiber is going to contract or all the muscle fibers simultaneously are going to contract like one single unit. This is the all or the none phenomena. And eventually the acetylcholine, after the successful muscle depolarization, gets metabolized into acetyl coenzyme A. Also, you have to remember the metabolites of acetylcholine and choline or cholic acid with the help of an enzyme which is known by the name of acetylcholine esterase. Okay, the enzyme is acetylcholine esterase. And the only one thing that is important in the synaptic cleft is its thickness. It is just 50 nanometers thick. So this is your neuromuscular junction. Now moving forward, the action of the neuromuscular drugs. I'm not getting into detail of the neuromuscular drugs, but before we study the neuromuscular monitoring, you should just have a recapitulation of how these drugs actually act. There are two classes of drugs that we talk about. One are the depolarization blocks and other as the non-depolarizing blockers, right? The depolarizing blockers are the succinylcholine. Now how they work is they all are competitive. Please remember, they all are competitive agonists. Okay, which is different from non-depolarizing blockers because these all are competitive antagonists. These competitive agonists will go and bind to the receptors and lead to muscle contraction, which will be a sustained depolarization. They will cause a sustained depolarization which can be seen in the form of fasciculations, and eventually after the fasciculation will have the paralysis state because of the use of this muscle fibers. The depolarizing blocker, as their name suggests, they have one phase of depolarization, that is the depolarization phase in which there is sustained muscle contractions leading to fasciculations. That is, they activate those receptors. But they don't stop here. In case you have given a lot of dose of scolin or multiple times the scolin has been given, or there's one exception if the patient is suffering from one enzyme deficiency. Yeah, that's a star question. That is the pseudocholine esterase enzyme deficiency. If the patient is suffering from that deficiency, under all these three criteria, the patient has to go from phase 1 to phase 2 block. These depolarizing blockers have two phases. One is the phase 1 and the phase 2 block eventually. In the phase 2 block, what happens is there is acting of these depolarization drugs like a non-depolarizing blockers. This is the phase 1, that is the depolarizing phase, and the phase 2, which is the desensitization phase. Okay, what happens in desensitization phase? That even after the muscle or the nerve has repolarized, it is still insensitive to the action of acetylcholine, and it happens under the condition of excessive use of scoline, or secondly if the patient is suffering from pseudocholine esterase deficiency. The depolarizing drugs are going to behave like non-depolarizing drugs, because when we talk about neuromuscular monitoring, the phase 1, phase 2 and non-depolarizing drugs, these three act differently from each other. Now coming over to the non-depolarizing blockers. The non-depolarizing blockers, as already told, they're competitive antagonists. They're going to go sit on the receptor and they're not letting the acetylcholine to work, eventually leading to flaccid paralysis. Okay. One shortcut that you all have to remember is non-depolarizing neuromuscular blockers and phase 2 of the depolarizing blockers. They both behave in the same manner, whereas phase 1 is different from all these two. Now, there are certain questions which clinical scenarios come, which you all have to remember and judiciously answer to, thinking over that what is the scenario likes. For example, the first thing that you all have to know is why actually these skeletal muscle relaxants are given. First, there are three things. One, intubation, to facilitate the intubation of the patient and securing of the airway, as this is, I've already told, a very important component of general anesthesia. Second, maintenance, to provide a good surgical field, a motionless surgical field to the surgeon. And lastly, in the ICU care, in order to decrease the work of the breathing of the patient and put the patient, for example, of respiratory failure, on ventilators. These are the three main reasons why relaxants are being given. Second, why monitoring is required, as I've already briefed you, that under as well as overuse of neuromuscular junction can be hazardous. So what are the consequences if residual neuromuscular block is there? The incidence of residual neuromuscular block is up to 20 to 40%, and as I've already told, that if, just imagine if the patient has leftover paralysis and the patient is shifted into the post-op ward, the patient is eventually very much prone to be hypoxic, hypercarbic, or have airway obstruction, laryngeal and pharyngeal disturbances, eventually leading to aspiration, pneumonia, or increasing the mortality and morbidity of the patients. Last, the clinical scenarios which are given on how you are actually going to choose which neuromuscular blocking agent are you going to give to the patient. In such scenarios, there are three questions which are generally asked. One, if the patient is suffering from, say, renal failure or liver failure, in these cases, we give the skeletal muscle relaxant, which is atracurium. I hope you are aware of the skeletal muscle relaxant drugs. So whenever we have certain comorbidities which are affecting the renal and the liver, the drug of choice is atracurium, which is of the class of the drug benzyl isoquinolones. And when this class of the drug is used, then which blocker, or the not actually blocker, which reversal agent is preferred is always neostigmine. We have two reversal agents. One is the neostigmine, other is the sugammadex. So if the question says that patient had chronic renal failures, or the patient is posted for renal transplant, or certain liver surgeries, or the patient is CLD. So, which antagonist or reversal agents are of choice? That is neostigmine, because in such patients, the skeletal muscle relaxant that is used is etracurium. Second, if rocuronium or vecuronium is used, then the reversal of choice is Sugammadex. Alright, or the other name for them could be the amino steroids. The amino steroids, the reversal of choice is Sugammadex in these cases, if rocuronium or vecuronium are being used. The third scenario which can come is if they tell that the patient is an emergency case and the patient's nil per oral status is not complete. In such patient, what we follow is rapid sequence intubation. And when we do a rapid sequence intubation, the skeletal muscle of choice is rocuronium or scolin, followed by either etracil depending upon the patient or vecuronium. Okay, so if they mention that only one drug had been used for rapid sequence intubation, that is always and always rocuronium, and the reversal agent of choice for rocuronium further is Sugammadex, right? And third could be that the patient had been given multiple doses of scolin, and now the patient is not coming out of the scolin because the duration of action of scolin is hardly 10 minutes. But even after a lot of time, the patient is not coming out of the relaxation that the scolin has given. So please think that the patient has undergone a phase 2 block, and now the patient is going to require a reversal agent. In phase 1 block, no reversal agent is ever given. Please remember, in phase 1 block, no reversal agent is given, because if reversal agent is given, it actually accentuates the or potentiates the action of the neuromuscular blockers. So in phase 2, reversal agent is always given, whereas in phase 1 block, reversal agent is not given. And this is another another way, or you can say, this is another scenario in which the monitoring of neuromuscular monitoring is required, because when we monitor, then only we can know that whether the patient is under phase 2 block or phase 1 block. I've already told you about the residual neuromuscular block. The uses of neuromuscular monitoring way, it could help us in choosing the right or the correct antagonist, whether we have to use neostigmine or we have to use Sugammadex. Then it can help us to decide which dose of Sugammadex or neostigmine we have to use, because depending upon how much residual paralysis has been left at the end of the surgery and how is the recovery going on, we may lead to different kinds of the doses. Like if the patient has already on spontaneous recovery, then we use certain lower doses of the reversal agent, or if the patient is under deep or the intense neuromuscular block, then we'll require higher doses. Second, the injection time, which is the most appropriate time of giving the reversal agent. This is something that you all have to remember. One is, just remember one thing, that are 10 minutes. Okay, it is always said that if neostigmine is given to the patient, after giving neostigmine, one has to wait for 10 minutes before the extubation of the patient. Before the patient gets extubated, we have to wait for 10 minutes if we have given neostigmine. So that is the injection time. Neostigmine has to be given only when spontaneous recovery of the patient has started taking place, and eventually after 10 minutes the peak effect of neostigmine wears off. And after 10 minutes of this, you can extubate the patient because the peak effect comes at 10 minutes. What is the appropriate time for intubation? When your diaphragm, the laryngeal and the pharyngeal muscles have relaxed. This also we can come to know through neuromuscular monitoring, so that when we are intubating the patient, there is no spasm or there is no hurdles that we face. Avoiding under and the overdose during prolonged infusions, like in ICUs, I already told you. Reversal agent in itself can be harmful. Please remember, both the reversal agents have a very big side effect of bradycardias. So there are certain conditions, there are certain conditions like cardiac condition in which reversal agent has to be avoided per se. For that reasons, neuromuscular monitoring becomes very, very important, because if according to the neuromuscular monitoring there is spontaneous recovery or complete recovery of the patient, then yes, we can extubate the patient without using the reversal agents also, because both of them have a potential side effect, which is bradycardia. So this also is a potential question which can come, that if the patient has cardiac arrhythmias or sustained bradycardias, so how is neuromuscular monitoring helping you? Because it will lead to, it will tell you that when full complete recovery of the patient has occurred, so that reversal agents can be avoided. Now, what is the full recovery? We'll come to it. Then comorbidities, I've already told, helps us in deciding which skeletal muscle relaxant we have to use, and eventually depending upon the skeletal muscle relaxant, the reversal agent can be chosen. Then surgeries requiring profound block, like your ophthalmological surgeries. And if these surgeries, there's even a slightest movement of the patient, it can be it can lead to grievous injury to the patient. So in such cases, we do neuromuscular monitoring to maintain an intense block of the patient. The fun question that comes and has already come is the most important time when neuromuscular monitoring has to be done, and that is at the time of the recovery. Okay, I repeat, the most important time in the whole journey of anesthesia is at the time of recovery, which is of utmost importance for neuromuscular monitoring to be done. So when we talk about neuromuscular monitoring, it can be divided into three parts. One, clinical assessment, which is highly unreliable. Okay. Second is qualitative assessments, which is done visually or through tactile perceptions using a peripheral nerve stimulator. And lastly, quantitative, in which a numerical value is displayed. This is highly reliable and preferred mode of neuromuscular monitoring. The most preferred mode of neuromuscular monitoring is quantitative analysis. Done? But still, as old as gold, so certain questions from the clinical assessment do come. The 5 parameters which has been told as reliable parameters out of all in the clinical assessment, which you all have to know, are: first, the patient can lift his head for 5 seconds at the time of recovery. First one. Second, the patient can lift his leg and sustain it for 5 seconds. Third, the patient has a hand grip which is sustained for 5 seconds. Then the patient can protrude the tongue out. And lastly, the maximum inspiratory pressure the patient can generate is of minus 25 centimeters of water. Okay, the rationale behind them is the head lift, leg lift and hand grip will eventually tell us that the peripheral as well as the central muscles have recovered well, right? And the maximum inspiratory pressure will tell us our respiratory muscles, our diaphragm, intercostals, they have recovered back. And the tongue protrusion is going to tell us about the upper airway muscles, that the pharyngeal muscles, the genioglossus muscle, hyoglossus muscle, they all have come back. So this is 5 seconds, head, leg, hand, maximum inspiratory pressure of minus 25 centimeter water, and tongue can be protruded out. Coming over to qualitative analysis, see, I have given you an option of qualitative as well as quantitative in these 5 because these 5 are done with the help of peripheral nerve stimulator, and further analysis can be done in 2 ways. One, visual or tactile analysis can be done, which is the qualitative analysis and not reliable. And second, a quantitative analysis can also be done of them, which is the reliable method of neuromuscular monitoring. That are the single twitch, the train of 4, double burst stimulation, tetany and post-tetanic count. We'll come to one by one in the further slides. And last is the quantitative analysis. In quantitative analysis, we have mechanomyography. Still very less questions, or I think none of the questions have been asked about the quantitative monitoring. So for the starting phase, I'll be telling you only the important key points in it. The mechanomyography, which sees the mechanical potential of a muscle. This is the gold standard when we talk about quantitative analysis, but this is obsolete nowadays. The most useful nowadays is electromyography, which can judge not only the peripheral muscles but even your diaphragms, larynx, and also the motor block that is given after central neuraxial block or the spinal anesthesia. That is the beauty of electromyography, which is the most used quantitative analysis these days. Then we have acceleromyography, kinemyography, which sees the kinetic potential and the acceleration potential of the muscles. Phonomyography, we have some very low frequency audible stimuli that are produced when a muscle fiber contracts. Yes, and that is monitored, and analysis is done through algorithm and we get a value. Then compressomyography and certain piezoelectric responses. Now coming to certain definitions that you all have to remember. See, these definitions are an overlap between your nerve conduction physiology and our neuromuscular monitoring. So let's study it fast. One is the maximal stimulus. What is the maximal stimulus? Yeah, that is the current which is required for the muscle fibers to contract, or the action potential to reach the end plate and let the muscle potential contract. In the neuromuscular monitoring, what we use is supramaximal current. Okay, what is supramaximal current? When a threshold has been known to us, then 20% plus to this maximal stimulus is supramaximal stimulus, which is used for neuromuscular monitoring. Now you all will say, but how are we going to know the maximal stimulus? Generally, the maximal stimulus that is required in human bodies is around 20 to 60 milliamperes. Okay, but the other way to find this out is single twitch. Yeah, single twitch is that we can help, this can help us to find which is the maximal stimulus which is required for the muscle contraction. Please remember this. If asked how are you going to decide for the maximal stimulus, you can do it with the help of single twitch, because the single twitch when we will give, it will help us to know whether the muscle is contracting or not. If it is not contracting, then we'll increase the milliampere, and the milliampere in which will have a respectable twitch, that is taken as the maximal stimulus we add 20% to it, so supramaximal stimulus is delivered. For neuromuscular monitoring, we can use two types of electrodes. One are the needle electrodes that provide us with a current of 5 to 8 milliamperes, whereas what we generally use are the surface electrode. I hope you all have seen those ECG electrodes, right? They are your surface electrode. The only difference is in generally the normally used ECG don't have a pre-gelled undersurface. These ECG electrodes are gelled, which helps to increase the conductance. They provide us with a milliamperes of 20 to 60 milliamperes. The skin resistance is also very important when we are doing the neuromuscular monitoring, because more is the skin resistant, more difficult it will be for the current to pass. So the nominal skin resistance that we have to maintain is 0.2 to 5 kilo ohms. Okay, to maintain that, I'll tell you a trick. For that, the trick is that before neuromuscular monitoring, you have to rub the surface area very vigorously until and unless it is red in color, so that there are no oils and the resistance of the skin has also decreased. So this is one of the ways that is asked, that how can you actually how the neuromuscular monitoring can be made much better. That is by proper preparation of the skin, by rubbing it with spirit thoroughly such that certain amount of redness can be seen. Two other definitions which are important are rheobase. Rheobase is minimum current which is required for the muscle to contract. That is your rheobase. And chronexy is the time which is taken for that contraction to occur when twice the rheobase of current is given. That is your chronexy. So we have a maximal stimulus, a supramaximal stimulus, a rheobase and a chronexy. This is your neuromuscular monitoring. This is a battery operated device. As you can all see, this is a battery operated handheld devices which has two electrodes in it. Can you see that? We have a positive and a negative potential leads. These leads are going to join the electrodes which are present on the skin. Always remember this, that the negative, which is the negative electrode, is always put distally, okay, and the proximal is the positive one, always. This helps in potentiation of the nerve conduction, and the muscle in itself is not directly stimulated. What we need is the nerve should be stimulated, which should take the impulse to the muscle. No direct muscle stimulation is required. So the negative electrode is always put a bit distally, around 1 centimeter you can say, from the crease if we are measuring the ulnar nerve, and the positive is always proximal. All or none phenomena I've already described to you. A suitable nerve has to be stimulated. You can choose any nerve. There are ample of the nerves which can be monitored during neuromuscular monitoring. I'll be coming to them. Then a transcutaneous current is transferred. Please remember, the current that we are giving is transcutaneous. A constant current of 60 to 70 milliamperes is what is given. Whenever the current is given, so the characteristics of this current being delivered has to be two. One, it has to be a monophasic current. Okay, the current has to be monophasic. The shape has to be rectangular, or it is also known as square wave stimuli, and the duration of the square wave stimuli has to be at least 0.2 to 0.3 milliamperes. If it is less, no stimulation will be there. If it is more, like it is more than 0.5 milliamperes, then there are very high chances that you are directly stimulating the muscle fiber. So these three characteristics you all have to remember of a ideal nerve current that is generated through using your peripheral nerve stimulator, that are, it has to be monophasic, a square wave stimuli, and the duration has to be at least zero point 0.2 to zero point 0.3 millisecond. These battery operated devices have an audible arm, and already told that negative electrode is always distal and positive electrode is proximal to ensure effective neurostimulation. These are all the stars ones. Yeah. Not asked but potentially can be asked, like the ECG electrodes. What are these ECG electrodes made up of? They all are silver or silver chloride. The minimum amount of the area of the contact that is required for neuromuscular monitoring is at least 7 to 8 millimeters. Anything that is going to affect your skin resistance is going to affect your neuromuscular monitoring, which could be like obesity or thick skin or pigmented skin or the skin like in diabetes or liver diseases, right? You have to clinically clean the skin before with the help of spirit. And lastly, you have to avoid a very important thing, that is hypothermias, because hypothermia or cold skin is quite resistant for the current to pass. And secondly, hypothermia is one of the very important reason which leads to prolongation of the effect of your neuromuscular blockers. So we have to avoid it. Moving forward, which are the potential sites of neuromuscular monitoring? The three potential sites that you have to remember for your courses: first, ulnar nerve. Okay, in ulnar nerve, we are going to put two electrodes, one centimeter from the wrist crease, and the second is around 4 to 5 centimeters away from the wrist crease. And what are you going to see is, and you put it where? You put it on the volar surface of your forearm medially, because there is your ulnar nerve and ulnar artery. And when this is stimulated, you see the adductor pollicis action, that is the adduction of the thumb is noted. The beauty of the ulnar nerve is, and why this is the most common site, ulnar nerve is the most common site for neuromuscular monitoring. The reason behind is that this is superficial first. Secondly, the muscle and the nerve, they are opposite to each other. And that is why the direct muscle stimulation is quite rare when we have chosen the ulnar nerve. This is the most common site of neuromuscular monitoring during all the phases of anesthesia, whether it is induction phase, it is the maintenance phase, or it is the recovery phase. Then the facial nerve is used to stimulate two muscles. One is the orbicularis oculi and second is your corrugator supercilii. These are the two muscles which get stimulated. In this, the electrodes are put either on the course of the facial nerve itself, or one is put behind the mastoid process and one in front of the tragus. Eventually, what you all have to remember in this facial nerve is that first, orbicularis oculi was being used, and in many texts and in many books still you can find that orbicularis oculi has been shown as the muscle of choice when we are talking about intubation phase. But please remember, the guidelines have changed now, and this is now ulnar nerve has replaced this nerve. Second potential area is, this area can be used when the restriction is there of your arms. Suppose the surgery is going on the arms itself and you cannot use your adductor pollicis, or because of certain positioning during surgery your arms or the hands are tucked inside. In those cases, the second choice of the site is your facial nerve. The third choice is your posterior tibial nerve, in which the electrodes are placed near to your medial malleolus, and what you monitor is which muscle? That is your flexor hallucis. The flexor hallucis muscle is monitored. So, briefing it again, if we are stimulating the ulnar nerve, the muscle that has to be seen is the adductor pollicis. If it is the facial nerve, then orbicalis oculi or corrugator supercilii. If it is posterior tibial nerve, then it is flexor hallucis. Paralyzed limb, again a star one. If it says that neuromuscular monitoring can be done on paralyzed limb or not, the answer is a big no. And the reason behind is that the paralyzed limb, because it does not function, so there is upregulation of acetylcholine receptors. There is upregulation of acetylcholine receptors, and thus there is exaggeration of the response that comes. There is upregulation. So paralyzed limb is never chosen for neuromuscular monitoring, because the degree of the systemic neuromuscular block may be underestimated, because there is upregulation of acetylcholine receptor. So the effect, the stimuli will lead to muscle contraction in these paralyzed limb, which will not be the same as all the other parts of the body, because there is upregulation. So it will, the stimuli is going to show that the muscle is contracting, and we'll see and we'll think that yes, the recovery has taken place, but this is not the same of the systemic neuromuscular block, which is still prevalent. Okay. We have to choose the right nerve for the right muscle unit to monitor. This is very, very important slide. See, in this slide, I'll be telling you that all the muscles of the body, they behave differently. Yeah, the muscle unit per se behave differently, whether we have central muscles, where we are talking about the peripheral muscles. Now, how are they going to behave is important for you all to know, because we have to choose which nerve has to be monitored, right? See, when we talk about the sequence of recovery, how are the muscles going to recover back? The first muscle to come back are your central muscles, diaphragm. This is very important. The first muscle to come back during the time of recovery is your diaphragm. Done. And the last muscle to come back during the time of recovery is adductor pollicis. This is what you have to remember. The first muscle that comes are your diaphragms or your laryngeal muscles. And eventually the late muscles to come back are your upper airway muscles and your adductor pollicis muscle. Done. What is the rationale behind this is, see, when we talk about diaphragm, the diaphragm is a muscle which is resistant to the effect of neuromuscular blockers. Okay, and if something is resistant to something, that is going to shun off the neuromuscular blockers from it very, very fast. They don't like neuromuscular blockers, right? So at the time of recovery, the first place where the neuromuscular block is leaves is your diaphragm, because diaphragm muscles are resistant to the effects of neuromuscular blockers, whereas your peripheral muscles like adductor pollicis, they are very sensitive. They actually like neuromuscular blockers a lot. So you can well imagine that if something sensitive that we are monitoring, like adductor pollicis, I told you, it has already started contracting and it is sensitive to it, then it means that certain things which are resistant to those blockers have actually, the blockers, or they have been actually recovered completely. Okay, if something sensitive has already left those blockers, then yes, something resistant has already recovered. That is why adductor pollicis is the nerve of choice, ulnar, which shows the adductor pollicis stimulation is the nerve of choice when we talk about the recovery phase of anesthesia. Then, when we are talking about the recovery, the one muscle to monitor is your adductor pollicis. Now, talking about the intubation phase, that's the first phase. Whenever recovery is taking place, the intubation, that is the onset of the neuromuscular block, is always in the reverse direction now. Yeah, the onset is going to be in the reverse direction. The first muscle to get paralyzed is again your diaphragm. I know you read what irony it is. This is most resistant, but still you say the first muscle to get paralyzed are your central muscles. Then how it is possible? See, this is possible because the blood supply of diaphragm is very high, and the drug that is delivered to the diaphragm or the central muscles is also high. A very high dose is delivered to them. That is why the onset of neuromuscular block is also fastest in your central muscles, and it is a bit slow in your peripheral muscles. Okay, and in between lies your pharyngeal muscles. So again, we can imagine that if something which is very slow for the onset of the neuromuscular blocker to occur, like peripheral muscles, they have already been paralyzed. So obviously where the places where the onset of the block is fast have been paralyzed already. That is why during intubation also we use peripheral muscles like adductor pollicis or flexor hallucis. I've already told in certain text you are going to find orbicularis oculi as the correct answer. Yes, orbicularis oculi was being used, but problem had been the pharyngeal muscles. The upper airway muscles were being left. That is why adductor pollicis or the peripheral muscles are now being monitored during every phase of anesthesia. You have to remember just thing. Okay. Talking about the surgery, again during surgery what we monitor is adductor pollicis muscle, but always remember that during your surgery when it is taking place, the resistance of central muscles is there more than the peripheral muscles. So yes, we can have those scenarios also in which the monitoring shows that adductor pollicis is fully relaxed, fully paralyzed, but your diaphragm has started coming out because of its resistance. That is why maintenance drugs have to be given not only through the quantitative evaluation, but yes, certain clinical assessment and judiciously monitoring of the patient is also required. During recovery, again it is adductor pollicis muscle which is used. In the recovery, of course, I'm going to come to train of 4, but the most important question that is asked is that in the recovery phase, the train of 4 ratio has to be around 0.9. I'm telling you this here because we have to remember this again and again. During recovery has to be done only when the train of 4 ratio is more than 0.9 and not more than just 0.7. Okay, the value is 0.9. Now coming over one by one of the various neuromuscular monitors, the first is the single twitch. As the name suggests, there is one single twitch. Okay, just one twitch. We give one stimuli of supramaximal current at 1 hertz, that is the frequency is 1 cycle per second. Every 10 seconds, such single twitches can be given. What is the use of single twitch? I've already told you. It helps us to determine the supramaximal stimulus, the first. And the second is that we can see a fade. See, this is a normal, that is the control. This is the single twitch, and the amplitude of the muscle contraction can be seen. When you have given the blockers, you can see the amplitude has come down. But the problem with the single twitch is, if you see it carefully, it has come down to the same degree whether we are using depolarizing blocks or non-depolarizing blocks. Thus, this neuromuscular monitoring cannot help us to distinguish between your phase 2 and non-depolarizing blocks, your phase 2 non-depolarizing blocks versus your depolarizing blocks, because it is not going to show any fade phenomena, and only the amplitude of the twitch is going to decrease. This is the single twitch. Single twitch these days is not clinically used. The only utility of the single twitch, if asked, is to determine the supramaximal stimulus. Done? It is given at a supramaximal current at a frequency of 1 Hertz. Train of 4, which is one of the most important. The train of 4, as the name suggests, it consists of 1, 2, 3 and 4. 4 supramaximal successively stimuli are delivered at a frequency of 2 Hertz for 2 seconds. Okay. Train of 4 is given 4 consecutive supramaximal stimuli at 2 Hertz. Each stimuli is of, as I've already told, it's 2 seconds, so we can divide it. Each stimuli is of 0.5 seconds. And you don't have to repeat the train of 4 stimuli in less than 10 seconds. Okay, this is the train of 4. When we talk about train of 4, we have T1, we have given 1, 2, 3, 4 stimuli. With every stimuli, we can see one line. T1, T2, T3 and eventually T4. In depolarization blocks, that is colon, all these 4 stimuli are going to decrease in amplitude. That is it. They're only going to decrease in amplitude. Whereas when we talk about the non-depolarizing blocks, they are going to show a phenomena known as the fade phenomena, in which the T4 amplitude decreases more than the T1 amplitude, and this is how it fades. Slowly and slowly it will fade. This is T1, T2, T3 and T4, in which the amplitude is also going to decrease with each stimuli, whereas in the depolarizing blocks, the amplitude per se decreases, but it is the same for all the 4 stimuli. Whereas in non-depolarizing blocks, the amplitude of each stimuli also decreases differently. That is the fading phenomena. And the ratio that you all use is the TOF ratio. See, this is how the fading is occurring. You have given the train of 4 stimuli, and eventually the amplitude of all the 4 stimuli are different from each other. The train of 4 ratio is T4 upon T1. T4 is the first to go and T1 is the last to go, and vice versa occurs at the time of recovery. So the train of 4 ratio which has to be maintained during the surgery is 0.4 to 0.9, because T4 is always smaller as compared to T1. Okay, and at the time of recovery, as I've already told and emphasized, the train of 4 has to be, the ratio has to be more than 0.9 9. Yes, it can be also equivalent to 1. That is, the T4 and T1 are all equal to each other. The train or 4 ratio has to be more than 0.9 at the time of recovery, and the ratio is nothing but T4 upon T1. Other thing that is counted when we talk about train of 4 are these lines. That is, the train of 4 count is done. If we have 1, then we assume that 95% of the acetylcholine receptors have already been blocked, and so that if we have all the 4 coming, all the 4 stimuli are being displayed on the monitor, that we can assume that only 70% of the non-nicotinic acetylcholine receptors are being blocked. But what we actually sometimes monitor is T4 by T1, which is monitored most of the times, and sometimes that we monitor is train of 4 count. Done. This is the train of 4. 4 successive supramaximal stimulus given, and fade phenomena is seen, in which the T4 fades more than the T1. T1, then T2, then T3, and eventually T4. This is how they fade. Okay. Third is the double burst stimulation. See the details, that how many stimuli are given, what is the time. These are rare questions which, yes, can be deciding factors sometimes, but the most important thing is the most used neuromuscular monitor is the train of 4, but the most sensitive is double burst stimuli. Most sensitive and most preferred is double burst stimuli at the time of recovery as well as at the time of maintenance. But because of the availability, TOF is available more than DBS, but DBS is more sensitive than TOF at the recovery as well as maintenance phase of the anesthesia. So as the name suggests, the double burst stimulation, 2 bursts are given, right? Like 1, 2, 3, and then after a certain time gap, again 1, 2, 3. And where the fading is seen, we have given one time the stimuli. The second time when we give the stimuli, we can see the fading in this very stimuli. Okay. This stimuli which is given, each stimuli is separated by a distance of 20 milliseconds, and the duration of one stimuli is 0.2 milliseconds. And the difference between these 2 stimuli is 750 milliseconds. This all is given at the hertz of 50 hertz. Okay. This is the double burst stimuli, in which 3 bursts of stimuli are given twice, and the fade is seen in the second burst that is given. The second and the first burst are separated from each other by a time lag of 750 milliseconds. In the first, the duration of between the 2 stimuli are 20 milliseconds, and one stimuli lasts for 0.2 millisecond. DBS is more sensitive than TOF. Then tetani. Tetanus is nothing but one single stimuli which is sustained for at least 5 seconds and given at a frequency more than 30, generally 50 to 100 hertz of frequency is used. Yeah, one thing I forgot about telling in the DBS is that in the DBS also the same thing happens. When we talk about the depolarizing blocks, there is no difference, there is no fading, only the amplitude changes. Whereas in the non-depolarizing blocks, we have the fade phenomena that is seen, or in the phase 2 blocks also, the fade phenomena can be seen. The same goes for tetanus. For 5 seconds, a sustained muscle contraction is maintained, and it should not be repeated before 10 minutes. because tetanus is very, very painful. But yes, it is very sensitive to deep blocks. But tetanus is not used because it is very painful, especially in awake patient. After the tetanus, one more thing comes is the post-tetanic count. The importance of post-tetanic count is in the questions if asked. If this word is present, intense, if the patient is under intense neuromuscular block such that your TOF is not coming, your tetani also is not coming, then what are you going to do? For that, we use the post-tetanic count in those scenarios. What is the post-tetanic count? What happens is, in post-tetanic count, for example, you have given one stimuli and there was no response. Then you give a sustained stimuli of tetanus. For 5 seconds, you give a sustained stimuli of tetanus at 50 Hertz. Done. After that, what happens because of this tetanus stimuli, that your presynaptic acetylcholines which are present, they all come into the synaptic cleft. That is, we mobilize the presynaptic acetylcholine into the synaptic cleft, and once they are there, after around 10 to 12 seconds, we give other stimuli of single twitches. At 1 Hertz, we are giving around 20 single twitches. And now the amplitude of these single twitches is going to increase by more than 50% and it is visible to us on the monitor. Okay? That is, we have, you can say, primed our muscles for the contraction to occur. Under intense neuromuscular block, we use post-tetanic count. The normal post-tetanic count is 6 and a post-tetanic count of 3 is what is required during your surgery or during your recovery also. If we have a post-tetanic count of 1 to 3, then we consider that yes, the patient is recovering, and at the time of recovery, as already told, the TOF has to be more than 0.9. The post-tetanic count has to be 1. Okay. The post-tetanic count used only in the cases of intense neuromuscular block. This is your post-tetanic count. Like you had given a stimuli, but you were not able to see it properly or the amplitude was very less. Then a tetani was given, and after that single twitches were given and the amplitude increased per se. And this also is only possible in non-depolarizing blocks. In non-depolarizing blocks, this fade phenomena can be seen, whereas in depolarizing blocks, no fade phenomena is seen. Lastly, we come over to certain recommendations. When we talk about recommendation, the first, if asked, only quantitative monitoring is preferred. All right, only quantitative monitoring preferred. Recommendation, TOF has to be greater than 0.9 before you extubate the patient. We recommend that adductor pollicis should be used for monitoring. The muscle of choice is adductor pollicis. Eye muscles should not be used. Okay. When qualitative assessment is used, neostigmine should be used at the minimum depth of anesthesia. That is, neostigmine should always be used when the patient has started recovering spontaneously. Only at that time, neostigmine should be given. In the absence of monitoring, I already told the time lag before you give neostigmine and extubate the patient has to be 10 minutes. You have given neostigmine, your reversal agent, you have to wait for 10 minutes before you extubate the patient, because that 10 minutes is the peak time in which the neostigmine is going to work. Lastly, The only way to effectively monitor both normal and abnormal succinylcholine induced neuromuscular block is the single twitch, because in none of the others no fading is going to come. Now how single twitch is going to help? This is, we can correlate the ratios, that is, once the single twitch that comes is of amplitude A, right, and after scoline has been given, or we say that of course around 70 to 75% of the receptors have been blocked with the help of scoline, the amplitude decreases to B. So we can correlate the ratio of this B to A and eventually tell that yes, the patient has been paralyzed. So let's summarize. We studied about the train of four, in which in the phase 1 depolarization block, it is constant, only the amplitude decreases. Whereas in the phase 2 and the non-depolarizing blocks, we have a fade phenomena that is visible. Okay, one thing I think you all must be curious to know why this fade phenomena is seen only in non-depolarizing blocks. The answer to this is your pre-junctional acetylcholines. Okay, your neuromuscular blockers, when we'll study, you'll see that non-depolarizing blocks act on your pre-junctional acetylcholine receptors also, leading to this fade phenomena. So if the MCQ comes, what is the reason behind this fade phenomena? The reason is your pre-junctional acetylcholine receptors. Second, tetani, the same, constant but diminished in phase 1. In phase 2, you can see fade. Double burst, the same, and then post-tetanic potentiation, which is used in intense block. DBS is more sensitive than TOF, but mostly used we have TOF. So the TOF ratio has to be more than 0.9 at the time of extubation. So that is all about the neuromuscular monitoring. Hope to meet you soon again. Thank you.